Ryan is Hans.
Hans and Grant both should be remote.
Okay.
All right, we're ready to start.
Great. Good morning. I'm Lacey City Council Member Carolyn Cox, and welcome to what is going to be the last meeting of our City Council's Land Use and Environmental Committee. City Council is disbanding committees by the end of the year, and will be doing that work at its work sessions. We do have a full contingent today. So could I get a motion to approve our agenda?
Move to approve the agenda as published.
Second. All right. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Let me go ahead and take care of the land acknowledgement. Since this is our last meeting, we, the City of Lacey, are on the ancestral land of the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek, including the Nisqually Indian tribe and Squaxin Island tribe. We acknowledge and remember those tribal people not recognized. Sorry, I'm struggling a little bit with this tiny type. Who were absorbed or reallocated into other tribes for survival. We recognize the ancestors and their descendants who are still here. We recognize and respect the tribal people of the Treaty of Medicine Creek as the traditional stewards of the land since time immemorial, and their role today in taking care of these lands in perpetuity. We recognize and have the responsibility to call attention to the histories of dispossession, forced removal, and abridged treaty rights that allowed our nation, state, and city to develop as it has today. We recommended that community members read the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1854. Righty, thank you. So moving on to the first agenda item, we have amendments to the Lacey Municipal Code 14.34, flood hazard prevention. And we have Grant Beck here to lead us through that. Welcome, Grant.
Thank you. And thank you for letting me sit in for Samra here and present her hard work. What's going to be before the council here shortly is some amendments to our flood hazard prevention code, which, as noted, is chapter 1434 of the Lacey Municipal Code. These regulations are required by the federal government for us to allow our citizens to participate in the flood insurance prevention program and obtain flood insurance through that national program. It's a little bit of a silo and a redundant code because we're also required to regulate floodplains as part of our critical areas codes. And in our critical areas codes, we actually don't allow new development within the floodplain, which far exceeds any federal requirements for the flood insurance. However, we have to have these in place to be eligible for the program. And every so often, we have to make amendments to stay in line with the federal requirements. So that's what's before you and what will be for council here shortly. The amendments are fairly technical, and I've never had this work before, but really they're housekeeping changes to remain in compliance with the federal standards. I can go through the kind of the highlights if you prefer, but again, they're a little bit redundant because our critical areas code exceeds these requirements.
Do we need any formal action to send this to full council, or is that just a briefing?
Just a briefing.
Okay.
Yeah. And before the council, our recommendation would be to adopt the amendments so our residents can still benefit from flood insurance. Thankfully, we don't have a lot of flood buildings and floodplains, and I think historically we've only had 3 claims, and just over $8,000. So
Oh,
it's
wow.
not a major component of our community, but still important for those that do have structures within the floodplains.
Okay. Well, just for the benefit of anybody who might be listening in and may not be familiar with that, without going too far into the weeds, Grant, could you just kind of give us a quick sketch of the changes that you're talking about?
Surely. We had to add some new definitions and terms based on the federal requirements. Those include alteration of watercourse, area of shallow flooding, flood elevation study, floodplain administrator, flood proofing, functional dependent use, highest adjacent grade, historic structure, mean sea level, and recreational vehicle. And yes, we have to define all those very specifically, which is
Gotcha.
fairly common.
Right.
And then some amended terms in the municipal code: area of special flood hazard, flood or flooding, flood insurance rate map, floodway, lowest floor, and new construction. And then along with this comes a new set of maps that we don't have to adopt separately because our code simply adopts the latest version of the FEMA flood insurance maps.
Gotcha. Okay, well, thank you. And I don't know if you heard at the top of the meeting, I was acknowledging that this is the last meeting of this committee, and I want to thank you and the rest of the planning staff and everybody else who has supported this committee through our work.
Yeah,
It's really,
thank you.
really been good.
Rick put together a good team and really good people to work with. So
Absolutely.
and I'm proud to be part of this historic meeting.
It is. It's a history-making day, isn't it?
Yep.
All right.
All right. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Grant, and hope we'll see you soon. All right. Next, we have Hans Shepard, Senior Planner, who is going to lead us through the draft neighborhood commercial amendment.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm going to start by sharing my screen actually here. Hopefully everyone can see that now.
Yes.
All right, wonderful. So yeah, some of these slides might look a little familiar, but the primary focus of today is really kind of running through what our existing code is as far within the neighborhood commercial districts and what that really contrasting that with what that looks like in practice. So we have our code, but then within these districts, what does that really translate to on the ground? So as a little bit of recap here, let me see. There we go. Okay. So this is our project timeline. We started this project at the beginning or the end of last year and are moving on through actually the end of this year. The very beginning of it included kind of some broad-based community outreach, really without a whole lot of leading questions, just really kind of an informal approach to find out in a general sense what the community was looking for. We really wanted to get as many perspectives and as much feedback as possible during that initial phase. And then from there, we moved on down the line here, really kind of narrowing the scope of that at each phase as we move along the way. Really trying to get down to the nitty-gritty details of really kind of what everybody's looking for on the ground within these districts, both at the intent level and also at the design level and everything in between. So right now we're somewhere between that fall and winter zone. So we're really in that drafting code stage. And then we're going to be rolling this back out to the community at large to really make sure that what we're presenting back out is in fact what everybody has been telling us all along. So just one more round of confirmation that we're really on the right track as we move into the winter here. And then we'll be finally looking at incorporating those updates into our code as it's written today. So as a little bit of additional background, just so everybody can get oriented, these are the 8 locations of where our neighborhood commercial districts currently are located. And they are all along kind of the periphery. One of their primary goals or objectives is to fill a lot of those commercial gaps that are left by our other commercial districts that are closer to the core of the city. So they really kind of fill those periphery gaps. Yeah, I'm not going to name all of them, but there they are. And then I did want to include this slide. This slide really touches on our existing architectural requirements and design requirements that apply really to all different zones within the community. So this is not something that is specific to our neighborhood commercial districts, but it is important because the neighborhood commercial district really is kind of, it stacks on top of these design requirements. While remaining consistent with these codes, it kind of goes beyond that additional set of codes. It's really what creates the character for these districts compared to any other district within the city. So these design requirements include things like multifamily projects, commercial design guidelines, especially as it relates to commercial sites that are directly adjacent to residential uses, public transportation and pedestrian circulation, and then zones with pedestrian emphasis. So these are all ones that I wanted to highlight. There are a bunch more within chapter 14, but these ones are specifically related to neighborhood commercial districts and how they interact with the community around them. And then there's also things like stormwater, environmental performance standards, parking, and landscaping are also just citywide regulations that also apply to these districts. So that's something important to keep in the back of our minds as we move forward, that these will always exist in addition to the final format and wording choice of our districts, our neighborhood districts, I should say. And then I threw this graphic in here because I'm more of a visual person, and sometimes it's easier to talk about things when you're actually looking at a graphic. So really what this code gets at is a whole host of things, but that includes things like setbacks from the street, lot lines, articulation, so variation buildings, so it's not just one flat kind of expansive wall, if you will. Minimum building setbacks between adjacent uses, things like max height, required outdoor areas, and ground floor windows, things like that. So all of these different components are addressed within each district, also specifically for today within neighborhood commercial districts. So these are the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. Site coverage is one of the early elements within our current code as it's written today. Max development coverage is one of the requirements, and right now within our code that's listed at 70%. So that includes everything. So your buildings, your drive lanes, your parking lots, really impervious surfaces is what we're talking about when we're talking about max development coverage. And right now that's listed at 70%. I did want to note a couple things on that. That 70% is actually below both our moderate and our high density residential designations. So that is rather suburban in nature. So these are intended to be commercial districts. That said, the current code as it's written pushes those commercial districts into a very kind of suburban style feel, if you will, lower than the requirements for moderate and high density residential. So really kind of slotting in at that low density kind of tier right now. And what we're hearing, or what we've heard, I should say, from the community to date is that based on the example districts they've identified and kind of preferences and kind of the ideal description of what folks have been expressing that they're looking for, this seems to be lower than a lot of those other example districts that they identified. So yeah, something to keep in mind as we move forward. And then our max building coverage. So not impervious surfaces this time, just the building. So it's kind of the black cubes versus the blue squares, the diagram over here. Right now that's at 50%. And what we're finding again is that is relatively low compared to a lot of the other example districts that the community has identified that they would like our district to be more modeled after. And then I did throw this one example chart down here at the bottom. This is something that we pulled from one of the districts that was identified within our surveys. And it's an example of how you can start to move away from kind of max building coverage and get more into a dynamic, kind of more interactive human scaled space. This one has to do with parking. So one of the drawbacks of reducing your building size is typically a lot of what's not used for your building is just turned into ground surface parking as a result. We'll see that when we look at some of our districts, that a significant portion of each one of them really just is made up of parking spots on the ground floor, kind of surface level parking, if you will. So this is a way that encourages either below grade parking or street parking to still meet your parking requirements, but then it also frees up a lot of space within the district for other types of uses, open spaces, plazas, additional commercial spaces, buildings, that kind of thing. So yeah, that's a quick review of what our site coverage just limitations are today. And then I want to just apply that and look at some of our existing neighborhood commercial districts based on that information. So this one's Thornberry Crossing. It's on the corner of Yelm Highway and Ruddle. It does have a gas station to the north of this aerial, but this is kind of the south half. I wanted to focus in on a little bit of that just so we could kind of dissect it a little bit better. But what we see is that approximately 30% of this lot is made up of single-story commercial buildings. And then it totals around 80% of lot coverage. That's your impervious surfaces again. So there's not a whole lot of green space. There's not a whole lot of non-parking, non-building uses that exist within this. And really the character as a result is commercial with surface parking is what we kind of see here. And then there's a street view photo as well, just to help you get oriented. I think there's a Safeway, there's a Cutter's Point in the building right along Yelm Highway there. And there's some.
There's no Safeway, but yeah, that's where they, not in that plaza anyway. Like
Yeah, that one along the
Safeway is further over. Yeah, that's is all small scale. There's no Safeway in this one.
Sorry, Subway is what I was say there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then moving a little bit to the west, this is the farm. So this is located on College Street and Mullen Road. So this is another neighborhood commercial district. And again, we see a breakdown of single-story uses with surface parking. We do see a little bit more green space that's reintroduced on this one. So the building is approximately 25% coverage. The lot coverage is around 70%. And then we see a little bit more of that green space around the front. But still, the dominant character here is single-story commercial with a lot of surface parking.
Hans,
Yeah,
just to make sure I'm tracking on that last one on the farm, because the current built out, like the building coverage is so low relatively for the percentage wise, could the owner of that lot actually build additional buildings on that lot because it's not yet at the higher threshold for building in this zone?
Yeah, so the way our current code is written, there's really kind of two limitations. One is height, and one is lot coverage. So right now, as our code is written, there's you can build up to 50% lot coverage. So they're at 25 right now for this building, so they could go up to 50 for this site. And then you're also able to go up to 35 feet, which is around a 3-story building. So you also have a lot of vertical opportunity as well to capture a lot of that additional usable space at this site that's not currently being utilized at this location. So does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay.
But
Yeah.
before you go on, Hans, on that same lot, so if they say they wanted to add another building because they're only at 25%, would they be able to do that without doing like underground parking or something? Would they still be able to meet parking requirements and that kind of thing?
On this, the red rectangle that you see here, likely no. There is an additional neighborhood commercial district space to the left off the screen of this photo.
Okay.
So there are ways to do that, but with the parking requirements, so parking requirements are based on the type of use that's takes place there. So it would depend on the type of use. For example, if they're all operating at the same time of day, that creates an additional demand for parking versus if they're different uses that maybe operate at different hours. There's ways to get creative, but it is really dependent on the type of use that would be going into these locations.
Okay.
But that said, likely no, based on the current capacity of the site. So you're really looking at either street options at this point, which probably doesn't work at this location, or below or above grade in some kind of creative design element there. But yeah, so that's the farm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. This one is Briggs Tap House. We included this one as a discussion point because when we asked folks what they were looking for as kind of example districts, Briggs was one that was frequently identified as something that folks were kind of striving for their ideal example of what these districts could look like, I should say. So we see that approximately 40% of the coverage of this site is now buildings. So that is an increase from what we were looking at previously. We were looking at the 25 and 30. This is now kind of still not 50, but working towards that. And then still around that 80% lot coverage. We see a little bit more street parking that's counting towards this building. So they have a little bit more space to create some kind of more seating areas, a little bit more open space, a little bit more kind of gathering locations, that kind of thing. I will note that this is also a multi-story building, so you can actually get a lot more of that, the allotted square footage that is permitted within these sites without taking up as much of a footprint. So it's that vertical opportunity that you're seeing here. And this is a mixed commercial use. So I think that there's four different commercial uses within this building for reference. And then I did want to throw in, this is an example of, this is a residential building. I think it's over on East Side in Olympia by the old Madison Avanti School, I think is over there. But this is, I wanted to just show something at the other end of the spectrum of what 75% building coverage looks like. This building also has below grade parking. So the surface really isn't, there's a lot more opportunity for gathering spaces, open spaces, green spaces, kind of community uses that would typically get cut from other designs when you're trying to accommodate additional parking. There is also street parking in surrounding this building and then below grade, like I said. So there's residential with street and ground parking garage is what we're looking at here, but a lot more of a kind of higher density use. This is still that 3-story, so right around that 35 feet metric that we were talking about, that is our current limitation within these districts, but a much more kind of fully used the space in ways that really kind of accommodates a lot more activity. And then from there, I wanted to go into building size. So there's two different ways to talk about that. So there's maximum gross floor area of single uses, which is 10,000 square feet. Then there's the maximum gross floor area for a combination of uses, which is 40,000 square feet. And those are our only two designations as it's currently written within our neighborhood commercial districts. And what we heard is that folks are actually looking for a little bit more responsive code. So right now it's either your single use or your multi-use, and you have one or the other options depending on which one of those categories you fall into. But what we're hearing is that there's a lot more detail that folks would like to see, a lot more kind of responsiveness within the code to proposed uses to create a little bit more of a dynamic space. So what we did is we broke it out into a couple additional uses, including, single uses. We also created a category for supermarkets just to get a sense of how large they are on average, multi-commercial, multi-family, and truly mixed use, so commercial and residential. And I'll talk about those in a little bit here. But we went around the community and pulled some examples of what single use buildings look like. So this is up across the top here. I think it's called Our Place to Grow. That's out on Marvin near the Arco out there. It's a preschool. And that's right around that 10,000 square foot mark, which is the max limitation within our current code as it's written of a 10,000 square foot single use building. And then down across the bottom, we have a couple other examples. The one on the lower left is the Starbucks that used to be the old Grange Hall out on Yelm Highway. It's right around that 5,000 square foot mark. The one in the middle is the San Francisco Street Bakery, which was another example that a lot of folks identified as what they'd like these neighborhood commercial districts to feel like. That one is right around that 5,000 square foot mark again. And then this third one on the right over here is right around that 5,500 square feet. And it's Mud Bay. And I think that there's a groomer and a pet shop in there. So it's out on Marvin Road. But the feedback that we got on this one is that generally speaking, the types of uses that folks are looking for are a lot smaller in footprint than what we currently accommodate for a single use. So things like gas gas stations probably isn't the best example, but coffee shops, bookstores, banks, post office, things like that. Bakeries, things of that scale tend to be a lot closer to that 5,000 foot range than currently the 10,000 that we're currently accommodating. The caveats, yeah, go ahead.
Quick question for you on that. So the single use 10,000 square foot max limit, is that ground coverage, or is that total square foot of the building? If it was 2 stories, you'd have a smaller footprint, but you'd still be limited to 10,000, or no?
Correct. So this is gross floor area. So this is all stories combined, not just the footprint. Yeah. So all of the San Francisco Street Bakery one does have a second floor as part of it. But the rest of these are all primarily single story, to give you a sense of what that is. We will go into the multi-story in a little bit here so we can dissect that. But the feedback here is that the types of uses that are typically described as single uses that folks were looking for within these districts tend to be on the smaller side of things, around that 5,000 square foot mark. The 2 caveats here being grocery stores and preschools. The preschool example we have here in the grocery store we'll move into in a second here. But everything else really does fit typically within a smaller size building, whether that's a restaurant or a bookstore or something else. And then we did get a huge amount of feedback on supermarkets, specifically north of I-5. That was a common theme that we saw throughout. So instead of trying to push supermarkets and grocery stores into one of our existing categories, we wanted to just take a look at, on average, how large are these buildings actually on their own. And what we found, these are 3 different examples. The top one here is Metropolitan Market. So that one's pulled from the Proctor District, which is another popular destination that folks referenced within our outreach. It's right below that 30,000 square foot mark. We have Spuds on the lower left here. So that one's in Tumwater out by the airport. And that's right around that 10,000 square foot mark. And then there's this last one is Ralph's Thriftway over on 4th and State. And it's right around that 30,000 square foot mark. So what we're finding for right now, we either have 10,000 square feet for a single use or 40,000 square feet for a multi-use. Given the Ralph's, for example, has, I think there's a Starbucks in there and there's some other shops that would technically push it into a multi-use, but the rest of these don't necessarily really conform to either one of those very well. So the thinking behind that is that there might be cause or an opportunity to create a supermarket or grocery store specific category within these that can be more responsive to that and accommodating of that type of use specifically. Yeah, the feedback that we got is that folks are pretty eager for a grocery store and are pretty willing to do most anything to accommodate it. So that's kind of why we looked at those. And then
We might have heard that in the past, yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty common theme. So we did want to take a look at it. Moving into multi-commercial, I did throw Great Floors in here, not because it's multi-commercial, but I did want to show something that really was kind of in that range of a 40,000 square foot building. This one's out on Marvin. It's over by the Winco out there. It's 42,000, almost 43,000 square feet, but in scale and in character, I don't believe that this is really what we're going for based on the intent of these districts. But I did want to give kind of a perspective of what a 40,000 square foot building looked like. In contrast, yeah, go ahead.
I hate to keep interrupting you, but question for you.
No,
What is, I mean, you gave some examples on grocery stores, but what about like the full service grocery, like a Fred Meyer or a Safeway, or what kind of square footage is that, like in a Safeway store?
So those are larger, and they're that 40, even 50,000 plus.
Okay.
They are more regional in character. These neighborhood commercial districts are, at least the current intent as it's written, is intended to be more neighborhood scale. So we don't anticipate that style, either a Fred Meyer or a Safeway or something of that scale, really being a good fit for these locations. And or even really having a desire to be located in one of these districts. They're better suited for our kind of central core areas or our kind of more general commercial zones. So while we did hear feedback for grocery stores. They were smaller in nature. They were more kind of co-op sized, spud sized. Yeah, more kind of oriented towards that local customer base, if you will, instead of a larger regional draw. So,
Thank you.
yeah, for sure. And by all means, if you have more questions, this is what this is all about. So keep asking them. Yeah, so for other multi-commercial examples, we have the farm that which already discussed a little bit down here in the lower left. We have the Vic's Pizzeria / Olympia Coffee Roasters over in the Wildwood district, I believe is what that's called. And then we have the Briggs Y Tap House over on the right. And so each one of these falls into that 5,000 to 7,000 square foot coverage. The caveat here being the Briggs one does have that second story. So the gross floor area of the Briggs Tap House is right around actually 13,000 square feet, whereas the other ones are right around that 5,000 to 7,000 square feet, to kind of give you an idea of what that scale looks like. And these are again, the types of uses that folks are asking for within these districts. So that's your coffee shop, maybe your pharmacy, maybe a veterinarian, things like that. What we're finding when we're looking around is that these types of uses don't require as much space as we're currently accommodating with at that 40,000 square foot scale. So some of the feedback might be smaller buildings and more people-oriented spaces, so a little bit more dynamic, a little bit more opportunity to kind of walk around and through and interact with spaces, a little bit more gathering spaces, that kind of thing is kind of the common themes that we're hearing and pulling from the feedback that we've heard so far, and the example districts that folks have been identifying when they're looking for kind of the ideal version of what these districts could be. And then, yeah, have something? Nope. Okay. And then we did want to throw in multifamily. Reason for this one is that currently residential uses are only allowed above commercial, so on second story or above. So right now there's not an opportunity for residential uses within these districts as either standalone buildings or on the ground floor. That said, we did ask as part of the outreach that we did if that was something that the community was interested in, if this was something that they'd like to see within these districts. And a couple of the primary drivers behind this is that it increases the density of homes directly surrounding these commercial districts. So it actually adds additional support for the economic success of these locations. And it also offers the opportunity for some potential kind of softening of that buffer between commercial and residential uses. So there's an opportunity to potentially site multifamily units between the commercial uses and then maybe an adjacent residential neighborhood of some form or another. So there's an opportunity to soften while also further kind of supporting and stimulating that commercial use. So with that, we wanted to kind of look at a couple of examples around the community to get an understanding of, in scale, what could these look like, since there's nothing in our neighborhood commercial district code right now that specifically addresses them. So what we have is on the lower left here, this is actually Tilden Apartments, and I believe some of you may have encountered this on the bus tour. But that's a 3-story building. Its coverage is right around 10,000 square feet. And then its gross floor area. So each floor adds up right around to 30,000 square feet. Yeah, Robin?
I was just curious. I think it's mixed use zoning. Is that the right name for the zone that we have that has Doghouse Pints in it and has the hub apartments above it? So it's not neighborhood commercial, but that's one example that's in Lacey that has that, commercial on the bottom, residential on the top. How is that different from talking about doing this in neighborhood commercial?
Yeah, so there's really 3 categories. There's multi-commercial, which is different commercial uses, but no residential. There's multifamily, which is different residential uses, but no commercial. And then there's mixed use, which is a combination of commercial and residential within the same building. And that can be experienced in a couple different ways. So right now, as it's written, the only residential that's currently possible is mixed use above ground floor commercial. So it's vertical mixed use, if you will. There's also horizontal mixed use, which isn't really possible based on the wording of our code, where residential could be connected to commercial, but in a horizontal capacity. So it does have some residential on the ground floor, but still connected to commercial to create that mixed use designation.
And it sounds like the feedback we got from the community is that they're comfortable with that, the horizontal mixed use.
Correct. Yeah. So, and then taking that kind of a step farther, so that would still fall into that category of general mixed use of residential and commercial in the same building. And then there's potentially mixed use of residential and commercial on the same neighborhood commercial district site, but not necessarily physically connected in building form. And one of the other reasons that we're looking is that a lot of the feedback that we're looking or heard so far is that smaller building scale is a popular option. When you have these kind of large, tall buildings, it really kind of moves away from the human scale of the location. It's not as kind of interactive. It doesn't draw people in the same way that smaller buildings with more kind of pathways between more public spaces tend to be able to offer. So that's what we're seeing here. Does that answer your question? Yeah,
Excuse
go ahead.
me. I think what Robin was describing there with the apartments and the hub brewery there, isn't that addressed by the form-based code for Lacey Midtown?
So within the Lacey Midtown, that is a separate section of code, and that is where that design comes from. So within neighbor commercial districts, that's not
Right.
necessarily possible, but we're talking about looking at ways to potentially accommodate more of that style of design and development.
Okay, yeah, as what I was trying to get to is, could our form-based code actually be used to inform some of the changes we're looking for in
And-
neighborhood commercial?
And that's actually a great point. A lot of the feedback that we've been hearing to date has to do more with the design of the building versus the type of use that's allowed within it. So really, you jumped ahead of me here, and that's going to be a great
Sorry.
segue. So yeah, one of the things that we heard a lot throughout this is that the character of these spaces is really important, and provided that that character is maintained, the uses that take place within those buildings is kind of secondary compared to the kind of the fit and the feel and how they interact with the neighborhood around them. So that form-based code, this is what we've been hearing so far is kind of a form-based code light, if you will. So it's not full-blown form-based code. We still do have some uses that we want to allow and not allow based on the feedback that we've received to date, but definitely shifting more to kind of a form-based code hybrid to get more of that feel that folks have been describing and kind of pointing towards and have identified as what they're kind of seeking within these districts. So introducing a lot more of that building design requirements within this code than was previously written is kind of the direction that we've been going. And I will hit on that a little bit more in a little bit here.
Okay.
So any other? Okay. I have you guys going on a couple different screens here, so I have to keep looking back to check in on you. Okay. So yeah, these are 4 different examples of what multifamily could look like. The Tilden one is the one that's still under construction. The one in the middle here is, so since multifamily is still just a single use, if we weren't to change the code but accommodate ground floor residential, it would have to fit within that single use designation of 10,000 square feet. So that is a much smaller building than may otherwise be suited for these districts. So this middle one is downtown in Olympia. It's a relatively new building, but that has a ground floor kind of surface coverage of right around 4,000 square feet. The total is right around 11,000 square feet, with it being a 3-story building. So it's still a little bit above, but that gives you kind of a visual example of what a 10,000 square foot gross floor area multifamily building might look like. There's a lot of words in there. And then this third one across the bottom is Serenity Apartments. And I did cheat a little bit on this one because they are live-work units. So that ground floor does have some commercial uses in there. But this is a more local example that we might be familiar with that's right around 8,000 square feet coverage on the ground floor with a total gross floor area of right around 20,000 square feet, to give you an idea of what that building looks like. And then the one out on, I think it's Capitol Steps or something, out on East Side, we already talked about a little bit, so I'm not going to go too much into that one, but that's in there as well. And then the community feedback that I did want to touch on here is that ground floor is generally speaking okay. People didn't have a strong opinion on it one way or the other. But when they were discussing it, conversations included things like that it helps support the primary uses. So additional housing units in a close proximity to commercial uses helps stimulate and support those commercial uses. And then it also activates, so it creates additional activity at different hours of the day within these districts. So they're more active locations. And then they also provide that potential buffer between those neighboring commercial district commercial components and adjacent residential uses. So those are the conversations that we had around multifamily. And then finally, the last one is the mixed use. So that is the commercial and residential combination. And these are a couple examples of that. The community feedback here is very similar to the just multifamily. Again, the primarily supports businesses, it activates, it provides buffers to neighboring uses. And then these are 4 different examples. I included Annie's Flats. That's a relatively new building downtown Olympia. It's right next to, I think it's called Pet Works. It is a 4-story building, so I will note that really quickly, but I did want to find something that was right around that 40,000 square foot scale, just to give you guys a sense of what that looks like in practice. The ground floor is right around 10,000 square feet. So each floor is around 10,000 square feet for a total of 40. This next one right in the bottom center is right on 6th Street. I think it's the 6th Street Apartments. Andy's Bistro used to be in there. I don't think that they're there anymore. And I did cheat a little bit because the back half of this building does continue, but the part that you drive by when you're on 6th Street is right around that 10,000 square foot coverage. It is a 3-story building, so then that's totals right around 30,000 square feet. And one thing I will note here that we might come back to later is that it does, above the ground floor, it does have a little of a setback. So that is something that we heard was a popular architectural element that we can include in this. So specifically when you're directly adjacent to maybe single family residential uses, and you kind of have a 3 or potentially a 4-story building going up next door, having an additional step backs as you go up in height to lessen that impact on adjacent neighboring uses. So that's kind of a visual example of what that looks like. And then this one on the lower right is Serenity. So again, that's that live workspaces across the bottom with residential above. And then this last one is Row in downtown Olympia again. The ground floor coverage is right around 6,000 square feet with a total gross floor area of all 3 floors adding up to right around 18,000 square feet. So just some different scales and examples of what mixed use residential commercial buildings look like within the community. And then, so this is a kind of summarizing everything that we just really ran through. So we took community feedback, we looked at example neighborhood commercial districts from other areas, and really kind of looked at all of the design requirements within each one of those districts, coupled that with the feedback that we received to date to create some ranges, if you will, that really kind of better align with the feedback that we've heard so far for each one of these types of uses. So we have single commercial uses, we have multi-commercial, multifamily, and mixed use. Moving single commercial uses from that 10,000 maybe down to something around 6,000 square feet, which really does accommodate all the different uses that we looked at, all of different types of uses that were listed within our outreach and our surveys and our feedback. And the single uses that have been described in other districts that were kind of identified as ideal examples of what these districts can be. And again, the caveats being full service grocery stores and preschools. Full service grocery stores, everything that we looked at really did conform to that 30,000 square foot range. The Ralph's Thriftway may even still be a little bit big for these districts compared for what we've been hearing. But even that one with its Starbucks, and I think that there's a couple, maybe like a Safeway, or sorry, Subway. I'm mixing those two up today. Would bump that into a mixed use or mixed commercial use of some form or another. So there's some opportunity to flex there. And then preschools, we looked at a bunch of different preschools, but those consistently were right around that 9,000 to 10,000 square foot mark, just to really accommodate different rooms, different play areas, things like that. But everything else really did fit cleanly within that 6,000 square feet for an individual standalone single commercial use. And then looking at multi-commercial uses, dropping that down to around 25,000 square feet and maybe even less. But that seems to be that range. But then also looking at individual building coverage, which wasn't something that was currently written into our code as it is today. It's just a total lot coverage. But kind of circling back around to that more form-based code approach, where we're looking at individual buildings and the scale of those to really kind of create the fit and feel of these spaces. So individual building coverage, adding that of around 8,500 square feet seems to be a pretty happy medium of the types of uses that we've been seeing, that we've been hearing about, that seem to fit within these districts based on the feedback to date. Creating a category for multifamily, currently we don't have a category for this, so it only, based on our current code as it's written today, is possible above ground floor. I just duplicated the multi-commercial for simplicity and kind of code application right now, but looking at example multifamily structures within our city, that does accommodate quite a few of those types of structures pretty cleanly, while still kind of creating a little bit of a limitation on how large they can go to really kind of meet the character of both these districts, but then also the surrounding neighborhood that they would be potentially landing in. And then the final one is the mixed use. So that's commercial and residential. And that's really that 40,000 square feet, which is how our code is written today, but with the addition of individual building coverage of 10,000 square feet. So it's still quite a large building, but that's operating with the assumption that it has both commercial and residential in it. So it's shrinking the ground floor footprint, but still accommodating that gross floor area through 3 different stories. So through height, if you will. Yeah.
So on the mixed use, Hans, does that eliminate the need for them to have to be vertical, where then in that case they could be horizontal, the mixed use?
So right now, as our code is written, you could have a 40,000 square foot building, provided it only takes up 50% of the neighborhood commercial district lot that it is located on. The addition here that we're exploring is creating a limitation on building coverage itself. So instead of that being a very large single story building, it could still be up to 40,000 square feet, but there is a footprint limitation. So it takes advantage more of that vertical height instead of that horizontal height, which creates kind of more of a, I don't know, dynamic space, if you will. So there's more things to interact with in a smaller footprint. Does that answer your question?
Not exactly. So you had mentioned earlier that one of the things that you heard was that people were comfortable with the idea of horizontal mixed use rather than only. So in other words, where the apartments have to be above commercial right now in the current code.
Mm-hmm.
But this doesn't address that part of it, I guess, then, right? That'll be somewhere else maybe.
So there's 2 different instances here. So there's multifamily, which would just be a purely residential building located on a neighborhood commercial district or property, if you will. And in that case, it's mixed use in the sense that there are residential and commercial uses taking place within this district, even though they're not physically connected within the same building. And then there's also mixed use where they are physically connected within the same building. And in those instances, our preference and what we've been hearing, and based on example districts, is still that would typically take place above ground floor commercial. It's not necessarily required to. So maybe there's like a plaza or some kind of entryway that provides access to those upper stories, residential uses. So this would be kind of introducing 2 potential new additions to these districts. One is a standalone multifamily that is still mixed use in the sense that it is part of a commercial district and it has commercial uses that exist on site. And then there's mixed use that is physically connected to the same building. When it's a standalone building, there are additional size limitations. So it is required to be smaller in scale. And then when it is worked into a commercial building with a lot more kind of ground floor activity going on, then that building scale can be larger to accommodate the additional residential uses, essentially how that works. Did I get closer?
Yes, yeah, you're good.
Okay. And then from here, I wanted to touch on building height really quick. So within these districts, as our code is currently written today, all buildings are limited to 35 vertical feet. By comparison, within our moderate density residential, there's a limitation of 40 feet. And within our high density residential, there's a limitation of 80 feet and then even higher, but we're not going to go too much into that. But the takeaway from this is that, again, these are, based on our code is currently written, very kind of suburban in style and very in line with our low density residential. So as a commercial use being required to be low density residential in kind of design and scale, we get a lot of these kind of horizontal single story surface level parking types of developments as a result of that. And then, yeah, so I threw this graphic in there because I did want to touch on that there are opportunities to, as you're going up in height, to move away from adjacent uses. So the step down graphic is kind of what that looks like. So kind of a staircase as you're going up in height. And then minimum building setbacks. So we already have within our design regulations in our design code that just covers all of our districts, requirements for vegetative buffers depending on the types of adjacent uses. So if it's residential, it's one type of buffer that goes between them. If it's commercial to residential, it's a thicker buffer that's taller and wider. And so there's additional elements there that really kind of work to soften that depending on the type of adjacent use. But the takeaway here is that at 35 feet, we're really still looking at a 3-story, really kind of suburban, low density style development, which is what we're seeing in practice in our commercial districts as they are today.
Can you really do 3 stories and 35 feet? Does that really accommodate for 3 stories?
It's going to be tight. It's not going to be a good building design. You can do it, but it's not a good.
I thought it was really more 2-story really for 35 feet, right? Because isn't a typical story at least 12 feet?
Yeah, the ground floor specifically tends to be a little bit bigger, and then the upper floors can get smaller. But yeah, you're really running out of height really quickly with that limit. So you really, in practice, what we're seeing within our districts based on the code that's written today is mostly single story. We have, I think, one example that I can think of right now that's a 2-story, and nothing that's a 3-story. So based on the feedback, based on the example districts, I think that there is appetite to go a little bit higher, accommodate some additional height. And then looking at our even moderate density residential districts even have a higher height limitation than these commercial districts by comparison. So something to think about as we move forward. And then building height examples. So these are just some text examples that we pulled from other districts that kind of look at that interplay between adjacent residential uses and commercial uses. But what we're seeing is that actually in most of the example districts that we looked at, 55 feet seemed to be a common height that would land just above our moderate density residential, but definitely not up to the scale of our high density. And then also with the 55 feet also providing requirements as far as setbacks, especially when you're adjacent to residential and specifically single family residential uses. So that height is possible provided there's additional kind of consideration given to what's immediately surrounding that building. So ground floor spacing out, and then as you go taller, also moving farther away to really soften that impact to those adjacent existing uses. So those are some of the text examples that we saw there that seemed like they could lend themselves well to our districts. Yeah, and that's kind of an overview of both what we have in our districts today, but then also the feedback and what those example districts look like by comparison within each one of those uses. So at this point, I really just kind of want to open it up to the group and answer any other questions you have, and we can go from there. Yeah.
First, this is like really great work. Thank you very much. This is extremely informative. Second, I think this is a good example of why we're changing our structure away from these committees, because this is something that the entire council definitely needs to hear this whole thing. So it kind of makes sense that we're gonna move this more toward the work session. I guess that's my question is, when is this coming up on a work session agenda soon? Because I think this is something that the whole council really needs to see and talk about, and because this was obviously very important to a lot of our residents. So I think this is like something we really need to have a much more in-depth conversation about.
Yeah, we've already met with our planning commission on this. So they've seen the presentation. We've now met with you guys. I think one of the next steps is, I might defer to actually Ryan on this as far as next steps go. But it's definitely available and something that we can take to the full council. We do have plans to take this plus some of the actual text revisions draft to the council and actually release it to the public at large to get additional feedback on. But the exact order of that, we can definitely be flexible on how that happens.
Yeah,
I'll
so
throw it out there to Shannon. Shannon, this goes right to the work you've been doing, so.
I'll let Ryan take the first swing and then I'm happy to hit next.
So as far as next steps goes, we don't want to get too far out and ahead of the planning commission process. We want them, really, the planning commission, to be the ones that are getting down in the weeds and kind of figuring this out based on the community feedback and the work Hans is doing and those kinds of things. So the next step for the planning commission, they'll be meeting next week to talk more about uses. So one of the things that we didn't touch on today was the uses. We're talking more about architectural form and scale and those kinds of things, which is a good starting point. As you heard from Hans, we're taking kind of that hybrid form-based code kind of approach to this. So the uses aren't going to be as important as they might have been in the old code when we had, permitted uses, conditional uses, prohibited uses, et cetera. But we still need to have that discussion. So our proposed schedule looks like, we'll have a formulated draft ready for public outreach and probably distribution sometime in January, which will align fairly well with the joint meeting between the planning commission and the council, which is scheduled for late January. So I might suggest that this be a topic of conversation at the joint meeting so that you can hear directly, not only from staff, but also the planning commission on the development of this. And I think we're probably scheduled very beginning of February to hold a public hearing, and then the planning commission making a recommendation shortly after that. So instead of having a separate briefing, I think we already have something scheduled with the joint meeting. So I might suggest that this be discussed as part of the joint meeting.
Excellent. Thank you.
And that timing works well too, because I was going to say, if we are doing a briefing, I'd like to wait until our new council member is seated so that he'll have the benefit of hearing this. It's a complicated thing to walk into cold. So. Any other questions for Hans or Ryan or Shannon?
I appreciate the presentation. This is really good information.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sitting through all of it. There's a lot of stuff going on.
A lot of detail there. Great. All righty. Well, is there anything else for the good of the order? Hearing none, I guess we'll drop the gavel on the final meeting of the Land Use and Environment Committee. And thank you, everybody. It's been a fun ride.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.